What if I told you that the most powerful weapon in all of human history was not a sword, not a cannon, and not even a mighty army, but a simple wall? And what if I told you that the thing which finally brought that weapon to its knees was small enough to hold in your own two hands? For more than 1,000 years, the castle was the ultimate weapon of its age. Picture it for just a moment. A single lord, standing safely behind thick stone walls, protected by a deep moat, with enough food stored away to wait out almost any enemy. That one man could hold off an army 10 times the size of his own. Entire kingdoms rose and fell based on nothing more than who controlled the castles. And wars back then did not last for days or for weeks. They dragged on for decades, because an attacking army might spend months, and sometimes even years, just trying to crack open a single fortification. The tall stone tower was the very symbol of military power across Europe, across the Middle East, and far beyond it. And then, in the span of only 50 years or so, all of it became worthless. Every towering wall, every round tower, every massive fortress that had taken entire generations to build, all of it, worthless. But here is the part that still amazes me after all these years. The thing that killed the castle was not a bigger army. It was not a smarter general. It was a simple tube, filled with powder, and a single heavy ball. So how on earth does anyone solve a problem like that? How do you defend a city when the very walls that guarded it for centuries can now be pounded into rubble in a matter of days? The answer was born in the workshops of Italy, and it would go on to reshape the borders of the entire world, including the very ground beneath our feet, right here in America. Before we go any further, let me welcome you back to the channel. I am so glad you are here with me today, and I want to thank each and every one of you who keeps coming back for these stories. If you enjoy history that actually explains how our world came to be, do me a small favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notification so you never miss what comes next. Now, let me take you back to where this whole story truly begins. Northern Italy, in the late 1400s. The Renaissance is in full bloom. Florence, Venice, Milan, the Papal States, they are all locked in a constant bitter rivalry with one another. They hire mercenary armies, they form alliances, they break those alliances, and they fight wars that chew through the countryside like wildfire. But at the very same time, something quiet and far more dangerous is happening in the background. Gunpowder artillery, which had been slowly getting better for over a century, was finally reaching a tipping point. And the moment that made this impossible to ignore happened far away from Italy. In the year 1453, the Ottoman Sultan laid siege to Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire. Now, Constantinople was protected by some of the most famous walls in the entire world. Those walls had stood for over 1,000 years. They had thrown back dozens of sieges. People believed they simply could not be broken. But the Sultan brought cannons, enormous ones, cast by a brilliant engineer for this exact purpose. One of these monsters was more than 16 feet long, and it could hurl a stone ball that weighed well over half a ton. The Ottomans lined these giants up in front of those ancient walls, and they opened fire. And within just a few weeks, walls that had guarded that city since the 5th century began to crack, and then to crumble. Constantinople fell. A city that had survived for more than 1,000 years was broken open by gunpowder in under 2 months. And when that news reached Europe, it sent a wave of pure fear across the continent. Because if the walls of Constantinople could fall, then no castle anywhere was safe. But here is what the history books often rush right past, and I do not want you to miss it, because this is the moment the knife was truly pressed against Italy's throat. In the year 1494, the King of France came pouring over the Alps with an army of roughly 18,000 men and 40 cannons. And these were not the clumsy, slow guns of the past. These were cast in bronze, they were light, they were mounted on wheeled carriages and pulled by horses, so they could keep pace with the marching army and be aimed the moment they arrived. And instead of stone, they fired solid iron. One Italian writer of the time watched in sheer disbelief as fortresses that had once held out for months were leveled in a single hour. In little more than a year, the golden age of the independent Italian city and the high glory of the Renaissance itself was staring straight at its own ending. So why exactly were these proud old walls failing so completely? The real problem, believe it or not, was not just the power of the cannon. The real problem was geometry. You see, medieval walls were built to be tall and thin, and that was perfect against men with ladders and battering rams. But against a heavy ball flying flat and straight, a tall, thin wall is the worst possible target. All that force slams directly into the stone, and the wall shatters and comes down. Worse still, those elegant round towers everyone was so proud of had a fatal flaw. Their curved faces left blind spots, dead zones along the base of the walls, where an attacker could creep right up without ever being fired upon. The old way of building was not just outdated, it had become a death sentence. And the men who would answer this impossible puzzle were about to change warfare forever. So how do you solve a problem that has just erased 1,000 years of military wisdom in the blink of an eye? Well, the answer did not arrive all at once in a flash of genius. It came the way most great ideas really do, through desperation, through trial and error, and through a few very stubborn men who refused to give up. The first clue came at a papal port on the Italian coast, where engineers made a choice that must have seemed almost cowardly at the time. Instead of building their walls higher, they made them lower, and they made them far thicker. A lower wall was simply a smaller target for a cannon to hit, and a thicker wall had the mass to soak up the punishment. They stopped building up, and they started building out. But the real proof came from two desperate sieges. At the city of Pisa, in the year 1500, an attacking army began smashing through the old medieval walls, and the defenders, out of sheer panic, threw up a massive, sloping bank of packed dirt behind the broken section. And something remarkable happened. That humble mound of earth absorbed the cannon fire far better than the proud stone ever had. The iron balls that would have shattered masonry simply buried themselves harmlessly in the soil. Then, at the city of Padua, in 1509, a defending engineer did something that sounds almost insane. He tore down his own medieval walls on purpose. In their place, he dug a wide ditch and built low earthen banks with platforms that jutted out into it, so his gunners could sweep the ground from the side. The enemy artillery pounded away and barely left a mark, and their assaults were cut to ribbons. And from these hard lessons came a single truth that would guide the next 300 years of warfare. Low beats high. Dirt beats stone. And angles beat curves. And there is a beautiful piece of science hiding underneath all of this, one that still holds true today. A soft, absorbent material behaves almost like a natural cushion. When that iron ball strikes packed earth, the material shifts and gives way around it, letting the ball sink in and slow down gradually, instead of transferring all that violent energy into one brittle crack. Remember that idea, because it is going to come roaring back later in this story, on American soil. Now, all of this was leading toward the single greatest invention in the history of fortification. It was called the bastion. Picture an arrow-shaped wedge of stone and earth, pushing outward from the corner of a wall. Why did this simple shape matter so much? Because of one thing, crossfire. When an attacker approached the wall between two of these wedges, the defenders on each one could fire straight along the face of the wall, catching the enemy from the side. There were no more blind spots. Not a single inch of that wall went uncovered. Wherever you stood, you were always in someone's line of fire. And these shapes were not guessed at. Renaissance engineers used geometry and trigonometry to calculate the exact angle and length of every single face, so that each line of defense supported the next. Building a fort had become a genuine science. And they did not stop at one wall. They wrapped the whole thing in layer upon layer, a deep ditch, a long, gentle slope out front that forced attackers uphill into the guns, triangular islands of defense sitting in the ditch itself, and hidden passages for the defenders. So let me put you right there in the middle of it. Imagine you are the soldier who has just been ordered to take one of these forts. First, you have to cross a wide-open slope with nowhere to hide while fire rains down on you from ahead. If you survive that, you drop down into a deep ditch, and now the guns are hitting you from 3 different directions at the very same time. This was not a wall anymore. This was a machine, built out of pure mathematics, and it was designed for one purpose only: to kill you. The most breathtaking expression of this entire idea was a city built from nothing by the Republic of Venice in the year 1593. It was designed from the ground up as a perfect star. 9 bastions reach out from its walls like the points of a star, and inside, the streets radiate outward from a central plaza in flawless, almost hypnotic symmetry. Seen from above, it looks like something drawn with a compass and a ruler, which is essentially exactly what it was. There is even a lovely old legend that the original plan came from a spider's web, drifting down onto a table during a storm, inspiring that radial design. Whether that tale is true or not, it captures something very real about how people saw these places. They were almost too perfect, too symmetrical, to look like the work of human hands. And this was the age when the greatest minds of the Renaissance turned their attention to defense. The very same master artist who painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel personally designed the defenses of Florence during a siege. Famous architects and entire families of engineers became the most sought-after men on the whole peninsula. The French had a name for this style. They called it the Italian outline, a quiet admission that this revolution had one unmistakable birthplace. But while Italy invented it, it was a Frenchman who perfected it into a true art form. And I find his story genuinely inspiring because he did not come from wealth or privilege. He came from minor, struggling nobility, and he rose through the ranks on nothing but sheer talent. He was wounded in battle more than once. Over his long career, he oversaw the building or rebuilding of roughly 160 fortresses across France. And here is the part that makes him a legend in my eyes. He was a master at building these forts, and he was equally a master at breaking them. He developed a slow, methodical, almost surgical way of taking a fortress apart, digging trenches ever closer under the cover of fire. So every single weakness he learned to exploit as an attacker, he then turned around and corrected as a builder. It was an arms race he fought against his own mind, and he reportedly conducted over 40 successful sieges and lost not a single one. His king used these fortresses as something far greater than mere military bases. He built a ring of them along the borders, as permanent statements of power, marking exactly where the kingdom began and ended. And this technology did not stay in France for long. The Dutch became masters of it, using the low, flat, watery land of their homeland to build forts surrounded by flooded ditches and canals, so that reaching the walls became nearly impossible. One of their fortresses controlled the only road into a key region, and its rings of water were so effective it threw back an attack decades after it was built. The Spanish and the Portuguese carried this design across their vast empires, from the Caribbean to the coasts of the Americas, to India, to Southeast Asia. A single star fort, held by just a few hundred men and a dozen cannons, could dominate an entire harbor, a river crossing, or a mountain pass. And in the Mediterranean, a small band of knights used these very defenses to hold their island against one of the largest invasions the Ottoman Empire ever launched, back in the year 1565. One respected historian argued that this changed the whole shape of war. Battles in the open field became almost pointless, and warfare turned into a long, grinding series of sieges. It was, he said, the geography of these forts that decided how wars were fought, and it forced nations to raise larger and larger armies. Now, scholars still debate just how far that influence really reached. But one thing is not in doubt. The cost was staggering, and it bankrupted the nations that could not keep up, while protecting those who could. And soon enough, this Italian idea would cross an entire ocean and take root in the ground beneath our very feet. And now, here is the part of the story that almost nobody expects. Because you might think star forts are a European curiosity, something you only find in old paintings of Italy or France. But the truth is, America is absolutely covered in them. There are old Spanish, French, and British star forts scattered across this country, and after the War of 1812, our own government commissioned a whole wave of them. In fact, the base that the Statue of Liberty herself stands upon was once a star fort. Let me show you 3 of them, because each one carries a piece of who we are. The first sits in St. Augustine, Florida, and it is the oldest masonry fort in the entire United States. What makes it extraordinary is what it was built from, a soft shell stone called coquina. When British cannonballs slammed into those walls back in 1702, the stone did not shatter. It swallowed them. The shells simply sank into the wall and stuck fast, as one stunned Englishman put it, like sticking a knife into cheese. Remember that natural cushion I told you about earlier? Here it was, protecting American ground. And that fort was never once taken by force. The second one, I cannot talk about without feeling something in my chest, because you already know it, even if you have never seen it. It is Fort McHenry, a star fort guarding the harbor at Baltimore. In September of 1814, the British Navy hammered that fort for 25 straight hours. And when the smoke finally cleared at dawn, the American flag was still flying above those star-shaped walls. A young lawyer watching from the water was so moved by that sight that he wrote down a few lines of poetry. Those lines became our national anthem. Every time you hear it, you are hearing a song about a star fort that refused to fall. But the third fort, down in Georgia, is where our story comes full circle. It was called Fort Pulaski, and a young Army officer who would later become one of the most famous generals in American history had a hand in building it. Everyone believed it was untouchable. The nation's own chief engineer once said that bombarding it would be about as useful as bombarding the Rocky Mountains. And then, in 1862, a Union officer brought something new to the fight, a cannon with a spiral groove cut into the barrel, a rifled gun that fired with terrifying accuracy and range. In just 30 hours, those thick brick walls were broken wide open, and the fort surrendered. More than 40 years of military planning vanished in a cloud of brick dust. And in a powerful twist of history, right after that fort fell, the commander there ordered the enslaved people on that island to be set free. That single moment in Georgia was a warning to the whole world. By the middle of the 1800s, exploding shells had replaced solid iron balls, and rifled barrels could strike a target from miles away. The Star Fort, just like the medieval castle before it, had finally been overtaken by better weapons. Within a few years, the same lesson played out on European battlefields, and the age of the Star Fort quietly came to an end. And so we arrive back at the question I asked you at the very beginning. How do you defend a place when the walls that protected it for centuries can be turned to rubble in a matter of days? For 300 years, the answer was this brilliant geometric star. And its forts are still standing today, from Italy to Florida to Baltimore. But the deepest lesson those old engineers left us is the one that still matters most. From missile defense to the cybersecurity that guards our lives today, the principle has never changed. You do not survive by building higher walls. You survive by building smarter ones. If this story moved you the way it moves me, leave a comment and tell me which fortress or piece of military history you want me to explore next. And if you have not already, go ahead and subscribe. I will see you in the next one.